Marc Edelman, who is a professor of anthropology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at CUNY. He has a number of books that he's written over the years in the field of agrarian studies, including The Logic of the Latifundio, Peasants Against Globalization. He's a co-author of Social Democracy in the Global Periphery, and he's a co-editor of Transnational Agrarian Movements Confronting Globalization.
Good morning, everybody. I've decided to overcome my ambivalence about PowerPoint, mainly because I have a couple of graphs that I will show you in a minute. I'm very grateful to the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to reflect on food sovereignty, because for many years there have been doubts floating around in the back of my mind in unsystematic fashion, and it's been gratifying for me to try to systematize those doubts and also to read many of the papers here that indicate to me that other people are grappling with similar concerns. I've been thinking a lot about Theodore Chanin's call to think more historically, and he said yesterday that it's not just about what happened, but it's about how we understood what happened at the time. And how we understood it is not just about how the actors understood it, but it's also about how intellectuals, academics understood it at the time. And 25 years ago, when I started to hear Costa Rican peasant activists talk about food sovereignty, I would have paid much more attention and taken more detailed notes if I had known that there would be a conference at Yale of this size. So the first part of my paper concerns the early uses of food sovereignty in Central America, particularly in Costa Rica, also a bit in Honduras. And it's clear to me that there's some origin stories that have emerged by people within Via Campesina, close to Via Campesina. And we all know what they are. About probably a third or a half of the papers for this conference repeat these origin stories in the canonical form. I regret to inform you that the proximate origins of the term food sovereignty are in a bureaucratic Mexican government program from 1983, the National Food Program, PRONAL is the acronym. And I know it's disappointing and that President Miguel de la Madrid of the PRI is not the most inspiring intellectual political ancestor, but the evidence is incontrovertible. And I'll show you why. There's a very nice lexicographical tool called Ngram that Google has. It allows you to chart over time the frequency of different phrases or words in the entire Google Books database. And you have over there food sovereignty, which you see it soar up in the 1990s and a little blip upward in the 80s. And here you have soberanía alimentaria. And there's a big blip up in the 80s before the giant blip in the 90s. And that big blip, the little blip there on the Spanish graph, refers to, its works entirely refer to this Mexican government program. So I'm sorry about that. And parenthetically, the canard that has been circulating that Marc Edelman is the first researcher to use food sovereignty, et cetera, that simply isn't true. There were many Mexican and foreign researchers that also used this in relation to, to this Mexican government program, which has been completely forgotten because, like many programs, it didn't have any budget line to accompany it, and it didn't have any real impact other than rhetorically. Another part of the paper questions this dichotomy that has been set up between food security and food sovereignty. And this is sometimes talked about as being a very profound antagonistic relation. I argue that both of the concepts are shifting signifiers. They're very complicated. There are multiple definitions, and they overlap very considerably. And certainly the way in which people were using it on the ground in Central America in the late 80s, early 90s reflects this. A lot of overlap. Okay. A couple of other things. I raised the issue of who is the sovereign's food sovereignty. And I think this is important, not just so that we have a clearer conception of food sovereignty, but because it has implications for how food sovereignty might be administered. Is it something that will be administered locally, at the national level, by some new type of institution? How will that institution be legitimized democratically? And maybe the biggest doubt that I have has to do with how to regulate long-distance trade and firm size. And I was very pleased to see that some of the papers for this conference actually begin to engage that issue with considerable seriousness, but I think it's one that deserves a lot more attention here, because somebody will have to lean on the successful farm and say, no, you're getting too big, you're turning into a latifundio, we need to rein you in. And who is going to do that? The final provocation has to do with the question of consumer taste, and this relates to long-distance trade and so on. If we're going to localize production, what does that mean for those of us who live in cold northern climates? What does it mean for those of us who are addicted to caffeine? What would it mean for a conference like this if they didn't have coffee breaks? So I think we need to reflect a bit in all seriousness on what types of products would be traded internationally in a food sovereign society, which ones would be off limits. There's some very concrete questions I think we're only beginning to identify and that need a lot more political and economic thinking. So thank you very much.